up, Shoreline? Welcome back to Small Groups. It is D-Town week. As you can tell, I'm thrilled. You're all going to get one of these t-shirts if you are showing up at D-Town. So if you have not signed up yet, tonight is your last night to have the chance to sign up. Make it happen. We're going to see you this weekend. But before we do that, we're going to jump into Habakkuk chapter 3 tonight, the finish of our study through the book of Habakkuk. We have been looking at this conversation this man has been having with God, his arguing, his wrestling back and forth with him, and we're going to finally figure out what is the conclusion of this discussion. So as we start out, I want to ask you guys this question. Have you ever found yourself getting into an argument with somebody that is younger than you? Any of you who have siblings or younger cousins or just somebody younger than you've known, sometimes those conversations can get a little funny by the ways that they respond. I remember having this argument with my little sister for a long time growing up, that she was convinced that one day she was going to be older than I am. This is obviously not true. This is clearly not the facts. She's younger than I am, and to this day, she still is younger than I am. But what she didn't realize at the time was that I had been around before she had. And whether or not she liked it, whether or not she felt great about it, this was the truth. This is what was factual. She was younger than I am, and that's the way it had always been, and this was something that she had to come and trust regardless of how it felt. So this is going to set our context as a reminder for where we are in the story of Habakkuk. As a reminder, the first two chapters have been about God and Habakkuk arguing back and forth. This is a man that lived, again, as a reminder, he lived in the nation of Judah about 2,600 years ago. And yet, even though there's a massive span of time between us, there's a very similar situation going on. Habakkuk was very concerned looking around at his country, at his people, and seeing destruction, violence, and if we're honest, he saw total chaos, and he was confused. And he had one question for God. He wanted to know, God, why won't you do something? Why is there evil? And why won't you do something about it? So God responds to Habakkuk and says, hey man, I know how bad it is. And here's the thing, I'm going to do something about it. I am going to bring in another nation that's going to conquer your nation. And it's Babylon. Now, if you know anything about your ancient history, Babylon was a wicked country. They were doing terrible things. And that's exactly how Habakkuk responds. He says, hey God, this doesn't take care of the problem. Like, we're evil, but they're worse. And we have to fix this problem. There's still evil going on. Why won't you do something about this? And God responds very graciously and says, hey, listen, there's going to come a day in the future where I am going to redeem all of this. I am going to take down all these nations that are wicked. All of the things that seem wrong with this world, I am going to fix it. Everybody's guilty, but the righteous, God says, the righteous are going to live by faith. And so that brings us to chapter 3. But before we get to Habakkuk's final response, I want to ask the question to you guys. What bad things have you seen in our world that cause you to doubt God? And as context, I want you guys to understand, like, this is something that I've wrestled with before. This is not something that is foreign and uncommon to people. Everybody at some point asks this question of why are these bad things happening? And it's okay if you found yourself there. We've all found ourselves there. So I want you to ask yourselves and to discuss as a group, what bad things have you been seeing that have caused any sort of doubt? Now on to chapter 3, this final section, Habakkuk's closing prayer. So let's start together in verse 1 of chapter 3. Habakkuk responds and says, O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So Habakkuk here in verse 1 begins to affirm that he has heard God's report. He has heard what God has said, and he begins to reflect on what God has done throughout his people's history. He reflects on his people's exodus from Egypt, from slavery, their time in the wilderness, God splitting the Red Sea. He recounts the plagues. He recounts so many things that have been happening throughout history and recounts. He says, hey, God has been faithful to us before, so I can trust you. But not only does he look back at God's faithfulness, but he begins to look forward at what God is ultimately going to do in a future exodus. So let's skip down to verse 13. It says, you went out for the salvation of your people. For the salvation of your anointed, you crushed the head of the wicked. So a little bit of fun vocabulary here. There's this phrase called predictive prophecy. And this is something that Habakkuk's doing here. Habakkuk is looking back on the original promise of God in Genesis 3, where God promised Adam and Eve that he was going to crush the head of the wicked serpent and redeem creation through Eve's offspring. And Habakkuk looks back on that and says, sometime in the future, God, your anointed one is going to come in and bring salvation to your people and crush evil for good. 600 years later, a baby comes along and grows into the man that we know now today as Jesus of Nazareth. 600 years prior. And Habakkuk knew that you can look back on what God has done and what God is doing in the future to be able to trust Him. So now to our last section we're going to look at, verses 17 and 18. Habakkuk has now looked at what God has done, how God has been faithful to His people in the past. He looks forward at what God is going to do and being faithful in the future. And because of those two things, he's able to look at his present moment, even though everything's falling apart and his country's going to have no produce, no money, they've got nothing. But he says, I'm going to trust in the Lord. Look at verse 17 with me. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, and yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Habakkuk here is able to look on everything that God has done and everything that God is going to do and find joy despite the problems around him. And I know that can be a really hard concept, but I want to ask you guys, what things can you look back on in your life and thank God for when times are hard? We all face hardships. We all face trial. We all look around at our world and wonder, what in the world is going on, Lord? But when we remember what the Lord has done to come to us, it helps us to trust Him. So as we close, I want to give you guys 3 simple points that are going to help us to illustrate exactly what was going on with Habakkuk's prayer. So here's the first one when you're looking at the problem of evil in our world. Here's the first one. The first point is that God has done something about evil. He has. This is why it's so important that Jesus came and died on the cross, and why every week you will always hear this at your church services, is that we understand that the cross is where God came in human form and brought man back to himself in a way that man couldn't do himself. We are reconciled. We're brought to God. We get to live with God in fullness of joy because of the defeat of evil and death and sin on the cross on our behalf. And this is good news. This is the gospel, that God came to us when we couldn't come to Him, and we know that God has done something about evil through His Son, Jesus. So our first point was that God has done something, but our second point is that God is doing something about evil. Right now in this present moment, even though things are crazy and we all have to wear masks and everything feels like it can fall apart at any moment, we know that God is doing amazing things in this world right now. He was in Habakkuk's time, He was in the time of Jesus, and He is now. We know that God is working tremendously in our lives. And this is why it's so important to reflect on what God has done, because it helps us to trust Him in the present. And then the last point, not only that God has done something and that He is doing something, but ultimately we as believers know that God will do something about evil. He is going to bring this world into ultimate restoration, and He's going to make everything right again. At the very end of your Bible, in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, we see this amazing picture of God restoring the earth and what everything will ultimately look like one day when He comes to dwell with us. In Revelation 21, verse 4, He says, He being God, will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And He who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. This is the good news of what God has done in our world. He did it with Habakkuk, and He's doing it now, and He's ultimately going to restore everything. And friends, this is the good news we get to go out and to share with the world. A world that is without hope, a world that is lost, a world that is hurting. We have the news of all news. It is that God has come to humanity. He loves us. He loves you. He is doing something, He has done something, and He is going to ultimately do something about the harm and the terrible things we see in this world, and we get to tell others about it. So let's go. What are we waiting on? So that's all we've got for the book of Habakkuk. Looking forward to seeing you guys this weekend at D-Town. If you have not signed up yet, make it happen. And besides that, have a great week of worship.